So yeah, Leah's asked me to talk on a really good topic, how to be patient, and from the book of James, the letter of James in the New Testament, chapter 5, 7 to 12. And I kind of think, gets me thinking, how patient am I? How patient are you? James, that we'll read in a moment, is much more serious, because it's saying, and it's talking about patience as one of the keys for living the Christian life to its full. So I want us to turn in our Bibles to James chapter 5 and to read verses 7 to 12. And I wonder if there's someone who might be able to read them for us. James chapter 5, verses 7 to 12.
Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, in this example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have perseverance. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no, or you will be condemned.
Great, thank you.
Did I read too much?
No, that was exactly the passage. Thank you.
Okay.
I've actually come to appreciate the book of James a lot in the last week as I've been preparing to talk to you tonight. And I listened to what is a fantastic Bible study resource. If you go to a website called thebibleproject.com, it really has some of the best overviews of scripture that you can find. I don't know if you've pointed these out to people before, but it gives wonderful overviews in just a few minutes, and it uses these doodles to kind of draw a picture and explains what the book's about. And the theology is fantastic, and the explanations are wonderful. So looking at the book, I learned from this short teaching video about the book of James, I learned two things. One, the author of James is one of the brothers of Jesus, who is actually a leader of the church in Jerusalem for maybe 20 years or so. But the book of James, it kind of leans into the Sermon on the Mount. That's Matthew chapters 5 to 8, the teaching that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount. James has lots of similarities and draws from themes in the Sermon on the Mount. But secondly, James also is inspired a lot by the first sort of 8 or 9 books of Proverbs. So Proverbs are, full of very pithy sayings and lots of metaphors and examples from real life. And so James does the same. He builds his letter around the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, but he does it in such a way as there's some great sound bites, lots of quotable verses in James, and it's it packs quite a punch. So it's a really, really great book. And obviously we're just looking at these few verses, but whenever you read a passage in the Bible, if it says at the beginning something like, be patient then, brothers and sisters, you say, okay, why is he saying then? It must refer to what's gone before. And in the chapter or two before that, there are some quite powerful themes which he's bringing out. So here are some of them. He repeatedly comes back to our attitude to wealth or poverty, and to rich or poor people. What is our attitude towards them? Another theme that runs through the book that he's referring to is difficult circumstances and hardships, and how we respond to those. Another theme are the words that we speak, the words that come out of our mouths, and how important they are and what they reveal. And lastly, there's a theme. Well, there are more than these, but these are just 4 I picked out. Aligning our lives with what is really at the heart of God's law, which is to love God and to love your neighbor. Those 2 commandments that all the law and the prophet hangs on. And so in his letter, James is kind of weaving these themes together, and they come out right now in this passage that we've read. So in these few verses, there's kind of 2 cycles where he's saying the same thing twice. There's a kind of an exhortation to patience, then there's an appeal to an example, and then watch out for your words. And then he concludes with a reminder that the Lord is coming to judge the earth. And these examples are really significant. And so if we're thinking about this question, which Leo gave me, thinking about how to be patient, well, consider the farmer. Now, how many of you are involved in one way or another in farming? Are any of you have a farm or have lived on a farm or have worked on a farm? No one. Oh, Leo has. And you know, and Jacqueline, you know how important, especially if you are an arable farmer, if you plant things in the fields, then the rains are so important. And so any of us who farm here in East Anglia, you'll know that the month of April was one of the driest for years. And so anyone who'd been planting the spring crops like spring wheat or other crops at the beginning of the year, you know, they got absolutely nowhere in April. But almost as soon as May came, the rains came as well. And we've had lots of rain this month, haven't we? But of course, you know, what was it like if you're a farmer and you've put a lot of money in sowing your spring wheat or whatever in beginning of April, and then no rain comes at all? I have another part of our community garden around the front had some rather bare bits of grass, and I went out and scattered some grass seed on it. I forgot to water it, but you know, I did this at the beginning of April, and no water fell on it for 2 or 3 weeks. And I belatedly went and put some water on, but I'm afraid those bare patches are still there because there was no water. And I was patient, but I wasn't very careful. But if you don't have the choice of taking a watering can, and if your life is in farming, as so many millions of people around the world are still today, those rains can make a difference between having enough or going hungry. Whether it rains or not is crucial. And so the patience of a farmer is an example which James is referring to. And then there's the other example, he says, think of the lives of godly men and women who have gone before us. There's a wonderful chapter in the Bible. It's kind of the first example of Christian biography. And it's Hebrews chapter 11. There's these lots of examples of people who trusted in God. It's a kind of the heroes of faith, because faith often involves patience, because you're believing that God is going to do something or to answer your prayers, or you're waiting for God to come through. But in that waiting, you need patience. And so James is using that as another example. People who've lived their lives of faith and patience, especially in the face of suffering. Now, I lived with my family in Romania for 11 years. We moved there in 1995 and left in 2006. And Romania was one of the harshest communist regimes in the old communist Eastern Europe. And so we met, and the fall of the communist regime was in 1989, the end of 1989. So we moved there about 5 years later. And so we got to meet a number of Christians who had really suffered for their faith, had been persecuted for their faith. And I came to appreciate the quality of faith that comes out of suffering, that's born out of suffering. And how I remember one of the early, we worked with a mission organization there called Youth with a Mission. And I remember one of the early staff conferences that we had, and there was a combination of Western people and Romanians we were together in the mission. And I was leading worship with my guitar or whatever. And then I kind of had to stop after a while, because I thought, here am I just playing these songs, singing away, and it's very easy for me. But something really hit me, because we were in a church, and I thought, just a few years ago in this country, Romania, if you had been singing and worshiping God freely, your life would have been, restricted in some way or another. There was not the freedom to worship. There were severe consequences, especially of any public, acts of worship and so on. And I realized there's a real price and a real quality of worship that comes out of a place of suffering, a place of persecution. So that's one of the themes from this passage. But let me open it up to you, and just thinking about patience. I don't know if any of you want to share something that you're having to wait for, something that you've perhaps been waiting for, praying for. Any of you needing to exercise patience for quite a while? An alien concept. We're back. So when we think about, often the world that we're in is, it's far from ideal. We are having to live our lives, and this is really the choice. And James is wanting to bring this out in his letter, that there are kind of potentially two paths that he is sketching out that people can take through life that is uncertain, that's difficult, that's unjust. And one path, which he refers to, is where we try to achieve safety or security by acquiring wealth by any means, by presuming on the future, and by resisting people who get in the way and putting them down and so on. But then he says there's another path, and that is a path that begins with trusting God for both the present and the future, living according to God's ways and laws, and not taking matters into our own hands, especially leaving God to judge those who wrong us. It's really interesting, this reference to God being the one who will come and ultimately judge and put the world to right. And this second pathway is definitely the harder of the two. But if we're honest, we have to admit that we have very little control over the circumstances of our lives. Things keep happening to us. We get sick, or we get caught in a traffic jam and miss that really important appointment, or we lose our job, or we order something online for the weekend and it just doesn't arrive in time, or people move into the house next door and constantly play their music loudly. We have lousy weather on bank holiday Mondays. Oh, well, actually, there's not much uncertainty about that one. Although amazing, this Monday is due to be quite fine. Let's see if it actually turns out like that. So how do we respond to not being in control? We can try and influence those circumstances and gain some measure of control, but for most of the time, we have to be patient and accept that we can't control everything. We live in an imperfect world. We live in a fallen world where things don't go the way that we would like them to, or the way even that they should. Let me say, sometimes there's a real tension here, okay? Because perhaps you're asking, well, what about God? What is God doing? Isn't he the Lord of our circumstances? Hasn't he promised to answer our prayers? And sometimes, as even you've just described, there's things we pray for, but they don't seem to come through. The answer doesn't come through. And some people can, end up questioning God. And whenever you talk about the topic of suffering, or in fact, whenever you talk about God with someone who's not a Christian or who's an atheist, they'll often quite early raise the question of suffering. What about suffering? How can a good God allow suffering in the world? And I think one of the things which I find really helpful, is to remember that God is not the only player on the field. Even though he's determined the rules of the game, let's say, and he's placed limits around that field, but others have free will, just like we do. People do things that are against God's will, and he lets bad stuff happen. And in fact, James refers to the story of Job, the example of Job. And if you've read that book, it's the most extraordinary book, because it's one in which, in the beginning of that chapter, God allows Satan to inflict a whole load of suffering on Job. And God said, test him. I'll let you take away all his stuff, take away his family, take away his wealth, take away his possessions, even take away his health. But he will go on trusting me. That's what God's faith in Job was like. It was extraordinary. The faith which God had in Job. We normally talk about it the other way around. How much faith do you have in God? But when it comes to suffering, sometimes it's a question, how much faith does God have in us? There's actually so much at stake in our response to when things go wrong. Are we going to give up on our faith? Are we going to be fair weather Christians? How much will we endure? Now, fortunately, I don't know. I've not had to endure terribly much. And there's other people I know who've had to suffer far more, not necessarily for their faith, but just through ill health and other trials and difficulties in life. But Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer, didn't he? That we should pray that, Lord, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Because clearly on this earth, God's will is not being done. There are lots of things happening that are not God's will. And often the consequences of bad decisions or wrong decisions, it may be our own poor decisions, take many years to work out in our lives. The consequences of other people's bad decisions, wrong decisions, even evil, can take a long, long time to work out. So this world we live in is far from what it should be. This isn't the world we live in right now, is not the world that God intended it to be. He created it good, but sin is at work in the world as well. So we live in this tension of an imperfect world, and yet a God who's come to save us, come to rescue us, and bring us life in all its fullness. But we don't get it all right away. We have to wait. And that's why patience is so important. And this passage, it refers to God coming to judge as well, because I think that's also one of the really challenging things, about the Christian faith is how do we respond to, other people seeming to get away with sin and evil and they seem not to have to give any kind of an account. And so this, if we want to see justice in the world, the idea of God coming to judge the world is really important for justice. A lot of people don't like the idea of God coming to judge the world, but actually there can be no justice ultimately if God doesn't have the final word. And because it's true, we may seek justice, we may try our very utmost to do what is just and what's right, but we don't see that happen very often. And so part of our faith as Christians is that God will ultimately put all things right, but we have to wait in the meantime. We need to be patient. So this patience is something which is absolutely vital while we wait, because it's in that place of patience, of waiting for God to come through, waiting for justice to come, or waiting for that trial or that suffering to come to an end. In that place of waiting, God is wanting to transform us. I remember hearing a story, I don't suppose it was true, but of a woman who, after the church service, she went up to the pastor and asked for prayer and said, "Oh, would you pray that I'd have more patience?" So the pastor says, "Okay, certainly. Lord, I pray you'll bring difficult people across my sister's life. Pray that she'll have real hardships come her way. She said, "Stop, Pastor, stop. I asked you to pray for patience." He said, "I know you did, but how are you going to learn and develop patience if you don't have hardships and difficulties?" And, we laugh at that, but it is an absolute key that's here in this book of James. And if you read the very first few verses in chapter 1, it's, James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete." I think that's a fantastic challenge for us, that there's no way to becoming mature as followers of Jesus if there aren't hardships and trials and difficulties on our path. And often we resent them. But I think if we hear James right, we'll realize there's something really important about them. And that is this, that it is through difficulties, trials, hardships, and suffering that that's the fertile ground for our character to really develop. And that's not a lesson that we like to hear, but it's actually really, really crucial. It's really important. So, life is a refining process. If you want to extract a metal from ore, from iron ore, if you want to get the iron out, what do you have to do? You have to heat it up in a furnace so it gets really, really hot, and then the iron, it all melts and it comes out, and all the rest, the dross as it were, is got rid of, and then you have that pure iron, and with other metals too are refined. So, but it's only through intense heat that ore becomes pure, that metal becomes pure. And I like, obviously Bear Grylls was teaching you last week, never give up. That is such an important lesson, because it's as we hang on in there when things are difficult, when things are tough, with patience, that we're being refined. So this is why patience is so important. It's because, especially when it's hard and there's some measure of suffering, because it opens up a space for God to be at work in our lives and in our hearts, refining us, showing us how to live life his way. It's a lovely prayer in Psalm 25, verse 4, which I quite often just pray. It says, "Show me your ways, O Lord, teach me your paths, guide me in your truth and teach me. For you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long." So just a lovely refrain, show me your ways, because so often we, it's not easy or it's not obvious. Teach us your paths, guide us in your truth and teach us. That should be our prayer, and patience should be our companion and our friend on that path. And of course, impatience is potentially so destructive, because when we're impatient, we try to fix things without God. We judge people quickly. We fret. We miss the sacredness of the present moment. And there's a quote here from Henry Nouwen, where he says, "Patience is a hard discipline. It is not just waiting until something happens over which we have no control. The arrival of the bus, the end of the rain, the return of a friend, the resolution of a conflict. Patience is not a waiting passivity until someone else does something. Patience asks us to live the moment to the fullest, to be completely present to the moment, to taste the here and now, to be where we are. When we're impatient, we try to get away from where we are. We behave as if the real thing will happen tomorrow, later, or somewhere else. Let's be patient and trust that the treasure we look for is hidden in the ground on which we stand. And I think there's something about that which really resonates, that if we're impatient, we miss something that God is wanting to do in the present moment. So he's wanting to show us in the present moment. So I'll stop there.